On this episode of Newt's World, in Wall Street's War on Workers, author Les Leopold shows how healthy corporations in the United States have used mass layoffs and stock buybacks to enrich shareholders at the expense of employees. He explains why mass layoffs occur and how our current laws and regulations allow companies to turn these layoffs into short-term financial gains. But how have these U.S. labor practices had an impact on our social and political life? Democrats have unarguably lost long-standing support of millions of urban and rural workers, and Wall Street's War on Workers explains why. Here to discuss his new book, which I think is a fascinating thesis, I'm really pleased to welcome my guest, Les Leopold. He is a co-founder and executive director of the Labor Institute, a non-profit organization. Les, welcome, and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
Thank you so much for having me, Mr. Speaker.
Can we start with the initial sense of history of the Democratic Party, which certainly from 1932 on was the party of working class Americans? And gradually that seemed to change. But can you talk first about what was the nature of that Democratic Party that at one time had enormous loyalty from working class voters?
Well, that Democratic Party was squarely behind the working class aims and ambitions. The idea of full employment, the idea of rising wages was essential to that Democratic Party. Should unemployment rise, that Democratic Party would find ways to put people to work. It was unabashedly in support of working people. It was critical from time to time of corporations, and Wall Street wasn't hardly even mentioned in those days. But it was also a party of regulation, that the idea was to tame the capitalist system so that working people had a better chance. And it was very clear to working people, I think across the country, that that's what the Democratic Party stood for.
Well, in that period, being a working person genuinely produced a pretty decent life, an ability to buy a house, an ability to look forward to a pension and a retirement. I think of my parents' generation. My father was a Democrat, very loyal to Roosevelt and Truman, and felt that the contract they had was working. And then it began to really decay. I mean, by Jimmy Carter in 1976, it's down to 52% among the white working class. And as you point out, it just keeps going down. And by Biden in 2020, it's down to 36% of the white working class. What happened in that process?
Well, I really struggled to try to understand that. And I think the primary determinant was the inability of the Democratic Party to deal with mass layoffs. Prior to 1980 or so, layoffs were something that corporate executives were embarrassed about. It was a mark of shame. They didn't want to do it. They understood that during recessionary periods, mass layoffs had to happen, but they believed that as soon as the things turned around, they would hire back as many of their workers as possible. That changed. And what happened was, I think the Democratic Party didn't realize that many of the policies that it supported, especially the deregulation of Wall Street, was making mass layoffs something that would happen in good times as well as bad times. And they took the blame for it. And I think we have very strong statistical evidence, especially in the blue wall states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, that the counties that suffered the highest degree of mass layoffs between 1996 and 2012, this is long before Trump, lost the most Democratic votes. And the counties that suffered the fewest mass layoffs saw an increase in the Democratic votes. And those counties tended to be higher income, better educated counties, usually around the wealthier suburbs. And the rural counties, which tended to be lower educated, lower income, and mostly white, they got clobbered with mass layoffs. They withdrew from the Democratic Party. On average, we looked at, there were 112 counties that we would call white working class counties in those blue wall states. We found on average 33% of the working people in those counties lost their jobs due to a mass layoffs between 1996 and 2012. And by mass layoff, we're talking about 50 or more workers laid off at the same time. That's a calamity on two fronts. Imagine you're in rural Pennsylvania, your facility goes down, and there's 1,000 of you looking for a job at the same time. Your friends and neighbors and coworkers are all running around trying to get that last job at Walmart or the dollar store, et cetera. It's humiliating and extremely difficult. As a result, one thing we do know now is that mass layoffs are an incredibly traumatic event. We have studies now that show this. Losing your job is the seventh most stressful event, ranked more stressful than divorce, a sudden or serious impairment of hearing or vision, or a death of a close friend. So if you put, well, we estimate overall since 1996, 30 million people have gone through mass layoffs. You're talking about a lot of traumatic events, and that's going to create frustration, anger, and disappointment. And the Democrats have taken the brunt of it. And I think they drank the Kool-Aid that if you just deregulated Wall Street, all good things would happen, all boats would rise, et cetera. I think you saw this even better than I did, that it was a problematic process.
You quote Senator Chuck Schumer back in 2016 saying, quote, "For every blue-collar Democrat we lose in Western Pennsylvania, we will pick up 2 moderate Republicans in the suburbs in Philadelphia, and you can repeat that in Ohio and Illinois and Wisconsin." Didn't that actually turn out to be a gamble that didn't work?
Well, a Faustian bargain, to be sure. Chuck Schumer, I'm sure, regrets having made that statement, and he's running around doing all he can to turn that around, as you could well imagine. But that statement turns out to be true on one level, a disaster on another level. In fact, in the states that he mentions, the data shows that they did gains considerably in those suburbs. But it's a gigantic mistake to write off any group of people. God, I don't have to tell you this, Mr. Speaker. It's in your DNA. You don't write off voters, ever. You just don't do that. What you try to do is understand what are their concerns? What are they really worried about? And job instability, I would argue, if not the number one issue in the country, is darn close to it. And you have to speak to that job instability. And Democrats who have not written off those voters, like Sherrod Brown in Ohio, and has targeted Wall Street, they've run way ahead of the national Democrats in those states that have turned red.
The classic liberal analysis rejects your economic argument. Hillary Clinton said, to just be grossly generalistic, you could put half of Trump's supporters into what I call the basket of deplorables: the racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, you name it. And unfortunately, there are people like that. So their analysis was somewhere between race and ideology that somehow had alienated these voters, not economics.
Right. I'm sure she'd like to take back that statement. In all due respect, she's wrong. We had to investigate that for this book. I had to convince myself whether that argument was true or not, because if it was true, then my economic analysis wouldn't hold. But what we did was we were fortunate. As you know, there are these very large voter surveys that exist, 50, 100,000 voters that they track over long periods of time. And they ask them a lot of interesting questions. And we isolated 23 hot button social issue questions, exactly the kind of thing that Hillary Clinton was talking about, the deplorable questions. For example, here's one. Should gay and lesbian couples be permitted to adopt children, right? If you're homophobic, you're going to say no, right? The number of people who agreed that they could adopt children in 1996 or so was 35%. Now it's well over 75%. Of those 23 questions, we could not find any that had gone down. And half of them, there had been a marked liberal direction as opposed to illiberal. So it turns out that the white working class is not becoming more deplorable. They're becoming more and more liberal, even on the question of immigration. This is the one that really shocked me because I didn't expect it. We went and checked the data several times. We thought it was wrong. Back a couple of decades ago, the question was, should illegal aliens, illegal immigrants, be permitted to become citizens if they've been here 3 years, paid their taxes, have no felonies. In other words, they're part of our working economy. You would think people would be outraged against that. Well, those who agreed with that statement jumped again from 30-something% to over 60%. 2/3 of the white working class today believes that we should basically have a path to legalization for the millions of immigrants that are here illegally, unlawfully, undocumented. It's a shame that Schumer and Hillary Clinton didn't look at that data, because I think they would have found that the working class is not all that different from the managerial class when it comes to social issues. What they're really concerned about is job instability. And in this country, if you don't have a skill that is easily marketable, where you can start a podcast, write a book, or if you don't have one of those skills and you're subject to mass layoffs, you're in trouble. You feel economically insecure. You know, this is the other part of the story. Those workers were told by both parties that, look, you may be having it rough because of globalization, technology, blah, 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 but your kids are going to do better because they're going to be better educated. They're going to get jobs in the high-tech sector. Well, last year, 262,000 workers in the booming high-tech sector went through mass layoffs, and another 75,000 so far this year. There is no place that provides stable employment anymore. And that is a problem for American democracy. And it's going to be a problem for both parties. Right now, the Republicans, I think, are benefiting from this, but they're going to have to deliver. It's going to be very difficult to deliver, because to stop mass layoffs, you have to stop certain practices that are going on right now, primarily driven by Wall Street. And that's going to be difficult, as you well know.
You really make an argument, which I think is a really important argument to look at, that automation, whether it's artificial intelligence or robotic or whatever, is not really the driving force here. That, in fact, it's corporate behavior that is the driving force. Can you walk through that just for a second, what your analysis is on why it's not a function of modernization and automation that is driving this?
That particular chapter came about because the publisher said to me, hey, I'm reading your book. The first thing I'm thinking about is AI. I said, well, okay, let's look at that. It's always been the case that we've all been fascinated by new technology. One of the biggest moves towards automation took place actually during World War II. And of course, what followed World War II was one of the largest booms ever in American history that your parents experienced, all the way from World War II, through, really up until the end of the 1960s, early 1970s. So automation has always been something that we've been worried about. But, there's been a lot of studies done about how long it takes for automation to actually have a major impact. Of course, look, we don't have elevator operators anymore. We don't have operators anymore for the most part. But the change is usually gradual. Challenger and Company does a report every month about layoffs. And I checked the report for January. And they actually have a little section on has layoffs from AI. This is quite remarkable. So there were 87,000 layoffs in January. The number of layoffs attributed to AI was 387. It's just not a fast process. And meanwhile, though, layoffs that are driven by leverage buyouts, private equity deals, and stock buybacks, they happen really rapidly. To finance a stock buyback, and I just make sure all your listeners know what a stock buyback is, the company uses its own earnings, goes into the stock market, buys back its own shares, which boosts the price of the stock. Before 1982, this was considered stock manipulation. You're not supposed to go manipulate your own shares because they thought that contributed to the great crash in 1929. There was a limit to the percent of profits that you could use for stock buybacks. It was 2%, and then they lifted the ban in 1982. Today, it's nearly 70% of all corporate profits go to stock buybacks. 70%. So that's a lot of money. And to get that cash, one of the first things you do is lay off workers. And if you can find a way to do it, you do it. The second big thing is when a company buys another company or a private equity deal takes place, usually most of the deal is borrowed money. And that borrowed money is then placed on the purchased company, like they did on Bed Bath & Beyond, I think. Went through one of these not that long ago. But anyway, and Twitter, you put the debt on the company. And then the debt service becomes the cost of the company. To pay for that debt service, layoffs begin. When Elon Musk bought Twitter, the debt service payments went from $50 million a year to $2 billion. He laid off half the workers. He had to, because he had to service that debt. Both these things could be moderated with, I think, thoughtful policy.
You spent a fair amount of time talking about Mingo County in West Virginia, but wasn't that a function of regulation rather than stock buyback? Isn't the collapse of the coal industry largely driven by the government?
The collapse of the coal industry is a complicated story. I use the Mingo County example. That's a very good point you're making there. I use that story because the vote for Bill Clinton was 69.7%. The vote for Joe Biden was 13.9%. So there was an enormous collapse in a county that was so Democratic, where the Cold Wars took place in the early 20th century. It was basically a war zone and then an occupied territory. It was only when Roosevelt came basically to support the United Mine Workers that the siege was lifted, and they were ever thankful that they voted Democrat forever. What led to the collapse of coal mining jobs across Appalachia, I don't know that we can pin that on regulation. You certainly can't pin it on stock buybacks either. It has a lot to do with the shift from eastern coal to western coal. Actually, it has to do with lack of regulation. The mountaintop removal that allowed, huge pieces of equipment to come in. And there's a case where you have certain kind of, I don't know if you call that automation, but a different kind of production process lost a lot of jobs. Where Wall Street does come in, however, has to do with the feeding on the carcasses. The Wall Street vulture capitalists come in. They try to buy up the collapsing companies and then eliminate things like retirement benefits for coal workers, which is, a terrible thing to do just to enrich Wall Street. I'm using that example to show that it can't be racism, sexism, et cetera. It just couldn't be that caused the collapse of the Democratic Party in Mingo County. It can't be that those people are deplorables. The other part of the story is what the Democrats historically would do in that kind of situation is come in with job programs. It would have been possible to go all over Appalachia, sit down with people and say, what do you need? Well, we need our schools rebuilt. We need better roads. We need the rivers cleaned up. We need internet. We need a lot of infrastructure. Mingo County lost the most coal jobs of any county. This county has 25,000 people, lost 3,000 coal jobs between 1996 and 2020. That's the most of any county in the entire country. So the Democrats historically would come in and create jobs. Even Jimmy Carter did that. And, we could have an argument about whether that's the right way to go. But the wrong way to go was to do nothing. Because what happened was free enterprise did come in the form of drugstores that became pill mills prescribing opioids. And 2 drugstores ended up going into a great free market competition. They figured out a system to put out 1 prescription per minute. One of those drugstores ranked 22nd in the country in a county of 25,000 people in opioid prescriptions. And you're counting all the big drugstores in New York, Washington, Boston, Los Angeles. I think about if you lived in that county, you see cars lined up to buy drugs. You have very few new jobs being created. The drugstores are not hiring a lot of people. You've lost 3,000 of the best paying jobs in all of West Virginia. I mean, despair would be the feeling I would have. And then that despair turns to anger. And the Democrats got the anger. And you saw West Virginia flip dramatically.
What would you do? What are your solutions?
I would take the stock buybacks back to 2%. I think we had a very prosperous country that way. That's number one. And also, there's all sorts of tax advantages we're giving Wall Street, the wealthiest of the rich. They don't need them. Second thing I would do is I would limit the amount of borrowed money you can do for a leverage buyout. But that's small potatoes in a way. The big one I would do, as you know, and God, you have seen this better than almost anybody, well, anybody I've ever met. The government puts out a lot of contracts. I think it's roughly $700 billion a year in government contracts that go to corporations. How about one little provision that says if you're going to take taxpayer money, you can't lay off taxpayers during the life of this contract? That provision right there would bring mass layoffs way down. And I can give you an apocryphal example. You remember Carrier Air Conditioner, where Trump intervened and kept the plant from moving to Mexico, and it was 2016, 17. They asked the CEO of United Technologies, which owns Carrier Air Conditioning, why did you go along with this deal? Here's what he said. He said, I was born at night, but not last night. We get 10% of our money from the federal government. He did not want to be in the crosshairs of the administration, any administration, because they do a tremendous amount of defense work, and they didn't want that work to go to somebody else. Well, I think this could be very fair. You don't have to take that government contract. We're not saying that all corporations can't do mass layoffs. That would be very difficult to do. The unintended consequences might be enormous. But you could tell somebody, look, you're getting $750 million this year. No layoffs, no mass layoffs. You can do voluntary mass layoffs. In other words, if you want to do a layoff, you can provide enough money so the person voluntarily leaves. You can do that, but you can't just get rid of them. That then raises the question, do corporations have the flexibility to live that way? The example I have in the book about Siemens, I think, shows that it does. When I went to this book, I did not think that corporations could prevent themselves from doing mass layoffs. I really didn't. I thought that it would lead me more towards the social wage. How do you help people that are laid off? That's sort of the traditional kind of do-good way of dealing with the problem. Then I ran into Siemens. Siemens Energy, which is controlled by Siemens in general. Siemens in general has 400,000 employees, German-based company around the world. Siemens Energy has 90,000 of them. And they decided a few years ago to get out of I think they were making compressors for fracking, and they decided they didn't want to do that anymore. So they're going to lay off 7,000 people, 1,700 in the United States, 3,000 in Germany. Well, in the United States, almost all of them turned out to be union plants. 2 of them were steel workers. 1 of them in Olean, New York, right above that southern tier of New York, right above Pennsylvania, very rural, used to be very industrial with Corning and all these other companies there. Now it's difficult. 500 steel workers with very good paying jobs out the door. And in Germany, something else happened. There they have co-determination, something that we sort of pushed for very strongly after World War II. Americans wanted workers to be on the boards of directors of German corporations because they felt that the workers would be less prone to go fascist again, where the corporation leaders were very prone to do that. So they thought this was a nice stabilizing thing. So half the seats of what they call a supervisory board of directors, are workers. And the tiebreaker is the CEO, chosen by the supervisors. The workers have a lot of power. They did a lot of investigating of the problem, and they're coming up with all kinds of different solutions. Finally, this is what Siemens agrees to. No compulsory layoffs, only voluntary layoffs. And the second thing they agreed to, and this was the stunner to me, and this shows me about corporate flexibility, 6 facilities in small towns were going to be shut down. 6. They agreed to put a different product in all the 6 plants to keep them open, so it wouldn't cause the kind of community economic harm. That's Siemens, and this is Germany, an export-driven economy, where you'd think they would be loath to do something like this. They did it. They're prospering. And in the United States, 1,700 workers lost their jobs by forced layoffs. Siemens in Germany, no forced layoffs. If they can do it there, they can do it here. And we should have held their feet to the fire, and we didn't. This is the interesting thing. Siemens, in fact, has a very large government contract. They provide, I think, something like $750,000. I think that might be a 2-year contract. They would have agreed to no compulsory layoffs. Are you kidding? They would have immediately agreed to that if that's what they had to do to sign that contract. They would have agreed. They did it in Germany, they could do it there. It would have been an easy argument to make. These big companies are really flexible. They have very complex systems that they can rearrange. For example, in Pennsylvania, there are layoffs going on at the UPS. UPS has the ability to move its delivery around 15 ways to Sunday. They could avoid compulsory layoffs. They want to do layoffs, fine. Bid up the price until a worker voluntarily goes. And workers are in all different ages of life. Somebody near retirement might take that package and go readily. It can be done. I think we're at the stage in America where we have to do something about mass layoffs before it really tears us apart.
You make a very compelling case, and your book has both a tremendous amount of information and I think poses some very important, challenging questions for the next administration. I think it's a very important book in that sense. And Lessa, I want to thank you for joining me. Your new book, Wall Street's War on Workers, is available now on Amazon and in bookstores everywhere. I think it's going to be a book people are going to talk about a lot, and it raises a whole new set of questions that affect tens of millions of Americans. I want to encourage our listeners who'd like to learn more to visit your website at thelaborinstitute.org. And I really appreciate you joining me.
Thank you so much for having me and for your kind words.
Thank you to my guest, Les Leopold. You can get a link to buy his new book, Wall Street's War on Workers, on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcasts and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.